Hey there. Good morning. It is Friday, November 15th. We're already halfway through the month. Holy cow, time flies. Um, I'm Rob, also known as that developer dad around here, and we're building .NET apps. Hey, Scott, how's it going, buddy? Yeah, it's probably coming up towards the end of your workday. Probably, what, about 4 o'clock over there, if I'm guessing right? Scott's over in Europe, so I have to guess at the time zones. Okay, you are GMT plus 2. Ah, yeah, flexible jobs are great, man. I would like any job right now. But I'm having fun building stuff, and it's keeping me sharp, and it's keeping me thinking about all kinds of things that I normally don't think about as just like a code slinger. I'm having to think about business processes and all of that stuff, and I feel like all this extra stuff I've been doing around the program that I wrote that I want to launch as a product is really going to serve me well the next time I am trading my hours for the means of survival with some corporate entity. So yeah, mornings are rough for me. I need a solid hour and a half, 2 hours before I'm ready to have my brain function. Yeah, I get that. I get that. Although I need to keep my working time, within standard U.S. business hours. Otherwise, September gets grouchy at me if I work longer and stuff like that. She starts to worry that I'm going to go through burnout, because I don't know if you've ever experienced burnout, Scott. It's it's a bad scene, man. It's a bad scene. So yesterday we started getting back into the administrative systems that I need for actually running. Oh God. So, well, burnout manifests for what does burnout do to you? Burnout manifests in all kinds of different ways for different people, and it really kind of depends on your psychology and your sort of inner way of relating with the world. Um, for me, I was constantly in a state where I was anxious at best and nearing panic when it got really bad, that I was letting my boss down, that I was letting my wife down. Um, I experienced sort of loss of sense of self, in that I fell into a place where I existed only to serve the company and only to serve my family. And that did horrible, horrible things to my mindset and my relationships. Um, I basically just existed to work, was the end of it. And you know how you, like, imagine a rubber band where if you pull it back like almost to its breaking point, eventually you're either gonna lose your grip and it's gonna snap and go flying across the room, or it's gonna break. Well, I felt like at the time that I didn't realize that I was feeling that way, because I was so focused on just keeping it all together and doing the work, that I didn't realize that I was making a whole lot of mistakes and operating from a place of fear, and that I had invested far too much emotionally in the job, not necessarily the work, but the job. And I started making a whole lot of mistakes, and I was afraid to talk about them. I was like, oh, I made a mistake. I have to fix it. Oh, I made another mistake. I have to fix that. And I just kept trying to fix things in real time and dropping balls and missing details and all of that stuff. And I was a mess, man. And I didn't have enough self-awareness at that point to realize that my dissatisfaction was with my circumstances. I didn't realize that the job was, and the environment and the relationships I had at that job were causing all of these negative feelings that I was having. So I misdirected those onto my family. And then eventually it got to a point where I couldn't keep up with the mistakes I was making at work. And I developed a panic disorder from driving, because I had like a 40-minute commute from the house to where I was working at the time. This was years ago. And I developed a panic disorder. This was, 13 years ago at this point. And I still can't drive on throughways because I start to get this just overwhelming sense of dread, and it actually takes on like physical symptoms. And even taking side roads and country roads and stuff like that, I'll sometimes get triggered by something, especially if I've got a stressful situation happening at the office or what have you. I'll still fall into a panic attack when I'm driving. But eventually the mistakes caught up to me at work, and we parted ways, myself and that organization. And it felt like this huge weight had been taken off of my shoulders. And I realized that all of this negative energy that I was misdirecting onto my wife and onto my home life and personal life and everything like that was actually because of that environment I was in and how hard I had driven myself. And I drove myself that hard because that was the professional behavior that was being modeled for me at that within that environment. The guys that were running the development department were developers, and they got into positions of management. And I don't think they're bad people, but I think they didn't know how to manage people. They were very, very focused on managing the work and the stuff that had to get done. Or perhaps, they were, and I just wasn't mature enough at the time to realize that they were trying to do that. I think it was, I think it was sort of a combination of factors. I was not very emotionally mature at the time. And they were very hyper-masculine, macho types. And I am not. I tend to, when I'm surrounded by people like that are that have a very, aggressive is the wrong word, but their energy is very strongly directed outwards from themselves. I tend to shell in and kind of back off because I'm not a big, strong guy. I'm not a fighter or anything like that. I'm very much a collaborator, passive type of person. I want to resolve things amicably without enforcing my will on the world around me. When I'm surrounded by energy like that, oh yeah, they were significantly underpaying me as well. But I'm trying to be magnanimous here. I am trying to be the person that I want to see in the world. So yes. I I fall back on logic as well. Um, I have a lot of trouble being blunt with people because I grew up with a few people who were brutally blunt in my life, and it never made me feel good. I never learned to, or I can't say I never learned to, but it took me decades to learn to accept negative feedback as an opportunity for improving my behavior or improving something that I'm doing instead of a criticism of myself. And I was probably into my 40s by the time I finally understood what it took to have a growth mindset, and that feedback is necessary for us to grow. And when somebody tells me something that I did or something that I am doing is suboptimal, it's not an attack on me. It's a, hey, what you're doing isn't working with this situation. We need to try something different. And it took me, like I said, decades to gain that level of self-awareness and self-confidence to be able to actually accept that kind of feedback. And that kind of modeled those realizations kind of modeled or crystallized in my mind the way I want to model the way I approach leadership, and I approach it very, very informally. And I like to approach it collaboratively. I style myself as wanting to be like the Bob Ross of programming, rather than say a Gordon Ramsay Hell's Kitchen type. I want to do more Joy of Coding than Hell's Development Lab. But then I see Gordon Ramsay working with children, and he's an absolute saint. So, yeah, Burnout. It was a really horrible experience, but the positives, I learned that I needed to, and I started learning how to put up professional boundaries. The next job I took, I had a lot less of a tendency to emotionally attach to the job. And whenever I start to feel myself getting emotionally invested in a particular project or a particular company or what have you, I take that as a sign that I need to back off a little bit, take a step back, and look at things a bit more rationally, a little bit more, a little colder, so to speak. Getting emotionally invested in people is completely different, but getting emotionally involved in some corporate entity or a job or a project or whatever, having passion is great, but tying yourself into, or tying a part of your identity into a piece of work or a company or what have you, isn't necessarily a healthy thing to do. Is one of those very, very difficult and very expensive lessons that I've learned along the way. So let's focus in on some of the stuff that I want to get done. I'm working towards being able to launch the DMs Familiar. The website is up, by the way. I finally figured out all the DNS nonsense, and boy, howdy do I dislike working with DNS, because it's one of those things where sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it takes a few hours, sometimes it takes a day and a half for the changes to take effect. So yeah, things aren't going to work immediately as soon as you push the button, but then you're sitting there wondering, okay, so is it not working because it hasn't propagated to all of the DNS servers, or is it not working because I screwed something up? And what did I screw up? And if the error messages aren't helpful, like they really aren't on GoDaddy, it can get frustrating and confusing and so on. And I find working with DNS entries and all of those records and stuff like that for setup is just, for me, it's fool around and find out development, which in some cases is fun. But in this case, because you don't have immediate feedback and you can't just say, oh, yep, there's the crash, it's incredibly frustrating to me. So yesterday we started getting back into the work of standing up this administrative subsystem. And I'm just going to quit out of Visual Studio Code completely. And we started working in the account manager on a customer builder. I should take some daytime meds. I can't find any. My nose is still really stuffed up and I've got some congestion in my chest and stuff like that. I was out I think Tuesday morning and then all day Wednesday because I felt like absolute death. It sucked. And I believe yesterday we were still focusing on dependency management and all that stuff. Yeah, I know. The sniffles are gross on Mike. And unfortunately, I don't have an easy way of dealing with them. So here's TDMF admin. I've got all these bloody windows open and I just don't need them. So let's open this up in Visual Studio Code. Boop. Wakey, wakey. Oh, looks like Visual Studio got some updates. I understand GitHub is doing some stuff these days. All right, so we've got, what's this Entra? Oh, Entra in process proxy. Cool. Oh, sweet. Mrs. found me daytime meds. Can you grab me some water, please? Taking this stuff with coffee sucks. Bear with me for just a second. I'm going to go to be right back and take some of these cold medicines so that I'm not snorting boogers in y'all's ears, because that's grody. Bear with me for just a minute, and then we'll dive back into this stuff. All right. So we need a customer builder. And in order to create the customer builder, we have some dependencies. I want to, here's my solution explorer. So the customer builder is going to be, I think I'm going to have it as an internal class inside the account manager. So let's add a new folder and internals. And I need a new file, and it's going to be a class called the customer builder. Now, I'm not going to put an interface on this. I am going to make it internal. And this guy is going to contain all of the logic necessary to create a customer object. Save that. Contracts. We've got a customer profile. Now, I've got over in the actual application code the definition that I want to have for customer profile. And I think my Windows laptop has finally woken up again. Yes, continue. That's going to take a week and a half to load. I'm just going to pull that over there so you're not looking at my silly face. All right. So we'll come back here. We've got all that stuff. I'm just going to save and quit out of there. So we've got the user identity access factory, Entra in process proxy. Got that stuff. That's right. Yesterday I had started building out the Entra thing. So we've got MS Graph options over here. And we need to store tenant ID, client secret, application group prefix. We may or may not need that. So what I'm doing with these settings is we've got a couple of different concepts of settings here. Now, tenant ID, that's environmental. Client ID, also environmental, as is the secret. And the application group prefix is more a configuration type thing. So, in my app settings, we can see that I've got this ResourceAccess, and we're going to add, what's the name of the contract? UserIdentityAccess. The assembly and Copilot almost has it right. It's just user identity dot Entra B2C. Save. So now it knows to look for this assembly when it's building my customer account manager. And here we've got our access factory. It's got public create service and private user identity access build service configuration config and I'm going to say user identity access service equals null. And I'm going to make it nullable. There we go. And then I'm going to pop down here and say, return the service. And Entra in process proxy equals new and I believe that requires an instance. Let's go take a look. Sure does. Pardon me. Now, we can't really do much here, except plumb these through. And return await service dot load user identity async, and there we go. And then I can say service dot set configuration with the options. There we go. Identity vendor, service dot identity vendor. Save. And now our proxy fully complies. Why are we using a proxy? Well, because the proxy allows us to modify the behavior around the actual service without altering the service. This gives us a interesting opportunity to actually comply with the open and close principle. The proxy is essentially a wrapper around the service. Later, I'm going to be adding the ability to inject pre-execution and post-execution pipelines into or around our services. And we'll be able to configure those. So let's say I have an architectural policy that I want to log whenever a service call is made. And I also want to publish a metric of how long each particular service call takes during the execution of a workflow. Well, normally I would have to go into all of the methods on the service and add the logging statements and the stopwatch and all that stuff. But if I instead inject a pipeline and then, just for sake of argument, run pre-call logic, run post-call logic. And of course, if we had a pipeline in place, I would have to, instead of returning, assign this to a variable and return it and return that value at the end. But those are the kinds of things that we can do with our proxies. Let's say we wanted to introduce some load leveling so that we're not overwhelming whatever dependency class we're calling. We could actually inject a task queue into the proxy so that when requests come in, it doesn't necessarily execute the request immediately. It just adds it to a queue. And then we've got private methods inside this proxy that pluck messages from the queue in a first in, first out fashion, process them, and then return them to the caller ultimately. All kinds of things that we can do with this. We're not going to do any of it right now. I'm just going to save this change that I made here. And we got to get back into our construction stuff. I'm just going to comment this bad boy out. And save. And I am going to take another be right back. I apologize, but I will be right back. All right, sorry about that. I'm back again. All right, let's get into building the service out. And for that, because this is just throwing up all over the place, we can't have that. I need to crib from my ResourceAccess Azure Table Factory. Now, there's a bunch of complex code in here, if I remember right. And if I remember right, it's ugly AF. I could be wrong. Okay, so configure service. That's right. Config bind, set configuration, and then we return the service. Okay, so this one ain't so bad. So what I need to do over here is first thing I'm going to do is rename this to configure service. Boop. All right. And I have MS graph options equals new, and config dot bind to those options. And it's going to want some kind of NuGet package. Let me take a look at what we've got over here. Configuration abstractions, configuration.binder. That's what I need. And let's add that. Configuration.binder. Go find it. Here it is. Boop. And I want 802 because I'm not using .NET 9 yet. Save. And it adds it. Oh, is it using implicit? I hope not. That'd make me annoyed. And then so rules access, configure service. And I have a user access, intra provider, service equals new. Pop out of here. Clean up my additional white space. And then service.setConfiguration and return it. There we go. User identity access concrete SVC equals configure service, passing my configuration. That no longer returns a nullable. And intra in process proxy equals a new proxy with the concrete service, and then we return the proxy. Save. And that should do it. Now, we should be able to soon spin up our thing. But before we do that, hey, we have a new follower. Hello DC. Give me a second. I gotta bounce over to main screen camera while I make sure I don't have anything sensitive in my environment variables, and I don't. Good. So we've got some additional things that need to get stuffed into our configuration. And if you remember, I'm using environment variables for, I'm just going to put a comment, use .env to store configuration that should be kept out of, no, it should be modifiable at the host configuration level. This includes connection strings, API keys, etc., until we use a formal secrets store for those. So, in our MS Graph options, tenant, client, and client secret are more variable than the fact that we're using MS Entra as our user identity provider. So these guys need to go into the environment. And because it's a dependency of the customer account manager, user identity access, and then tenant, client, and client secret. Tenant ID equals some GUID. Client ID is some GUID, some secret. Save. And just for laughs, app settings. Over in the options, I've got application group prefix, because that's less variable. Some string constant. And we're just using dummy stuff here. Yeah. And theoretically, we should be able to stand up this stuff at this point. So I'm going to drop a breakpoint right here. And that's right. It's in the manager that the build service is super gnarly, because the manager's got all kinds of dependencies on it. So let's try spinning it up. And I want to go to program. Here we are. Now, before we do that, let's go to the implementation of this. Here we are. Turn service, load, or create. I'm going to go to this implementation, not the proxy. Dang blasted. Managers. And where the heck is it? That's contracts, internals, customer account manager. Here we are. And I've just got some right line type stuff. Now, get required dependencies. I'm going to add type of UserIdentityAccess to my required dependencies. Now, rules access. Where is that defined? It's up here. So to give myself access to the user identity access, all I'm going to do is add like a private GAT that looks at the proxy collection and grabs the user identity access. User identity access dot load user identity async, and I'm going to say await no, I'm not. And I have to pass the user ID. Do I have a user ID here? Request data dot user ID. And I have to add that up here. Public string, user ID, get set, equals string dot empty. Good enough. So customer account manager. Dot result. What's this complaining about now? Var cust equals that. Good enough. And then inside there, I'm going to get rid of the async because that's not part of the interface. Get config frag, return null null. This is all just dummy. We're testing the stack, all of that stuff. And let's go into the user identity access. All I want to do here is async, fine, return console.writeLine, looking up user with ID. We'll use some interpolation. User ID. Return null. And yes, I know, blah, 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 it'll run synchronously. Fine. And private MS graph options, options equals null. Options equals options. MS graph. Options, we'll just use an implicit cast. Or an explicit cast, I guess. Save. And this should theoretically be able to run now. Here's get account manager. And here we go. So I'm going to drop a breakpoint there, and we've already got one up in the Entra builder. So we'll go boop, run and debug. We're not actually adding functionality yet. We're just making sure the architecture and the component instantiation and all that stuff is working for us. So let's step into create service. And so we need to configure the service. And this is where it gets goofy. And this is what I need to clean up and move out to a base class or what have you. Because this behavior is going to largely be the same no matter what kind of component we're constructing. And that tells me it needs to go into a base class. Or at least some of it. So we have to get the list of dependencies, and now we have two. We've got an iRulesAccess and a UserIdentityAccess. And we're just going to build these guys up. Oh, that exploded. What explode? I missed that error message. User identity, enter B2C. Could not find the file specified. Is it because I'm a dope? It's probably because I did something dopey. Let's take a look at our app settings. Enter B2C, good. And do we have a project dependency to that? We did not yet add that. So we do need to add that project dependency to our root. But that's all we need to add. Because what that does is it forces the B2C assembly to build and get included in the binaries that our root application has access to. So let's try running again. And I'll try to pay more attention as I'm stepping through things. All right, so we can step over that and step in here. And we'll step into configure service. We're getting the component config name. We're getting its configuration node. And we've got a whole bunch of sections in here. We've got a section for rules access. We've got a section for user identity access. And all of those good things. So, dependency type name is iRulesAccess. So what we want to do is we want to take a look at our component configuration and get the subsection of that component configuration that applies to the iRulesAccess. So step over there, and we see that we've got our rules access configuration. It's got all of the settings we need from all of the different places that we put them. And we're just checking to make sure we actually have one. If it's missing, we're going to bounce out and we're going to crash on startup. The app will stop running before it even really starts. So now we need the assembly. We've got the name of the assembly where our rules access contract is implemented. And then we just do some reflection goop to set that service instance. That's what all this stuff does, is it actually creates an instance of the iRulesAccess as defined in the Azure Table Provider. So now we've moved on to our, here we go, UserIdentityAccess. We're going to pull the section out of config, and it exists, so that's groovy. And we're going to do the building. We were able to load the assembly this time. And now we create an instance of that type of our enter b2c.useridentityAccess. And then we have to get, and that just means that we have an instance of that type in memory. So now we have to find the create service. Oh, no, wait, I messed that up. We have an instance of the factory. Remember that factory we were working in a few minutes ago? We've got an instance of that factory. And the builder type, as we can see, is UserIdentityAccess Factory. Now, all access factories must expose a create service because that's part of their contract, right? So we're going to get the method. We're going to get that function from that type and read that into our create method variable. And then we're going to invoke that method on that builder instance, and we're going to pass in the configuration, and it's going to return an UserIdentityAccess component. And here we are into that factory method, that create service. So we'll step into config, and we bind the options, the actual MS Graph options class instance. We bound that to the configuration that we passed. And we can see that there's like 5 sections on here. We've got application group prefix, assembly, client ID, client secret, tenant ID. We don't care about any of we don't really care about assembly, but that's okay. But we do now have an instance of those options that we need. And we can see that the application group prefix is some string constant, client ID is some GUID, client secret is some secret, tenant ID is some GUID, which is exactly what I expected to see. We've got our new UserAccess Entra provider. And now we're going to apply the configuration to it. And we can return the service, wrap it up in our proxy, return the proxy, and now we can take that proxy and we find the set dependency method on our service. And then we're going to call it. And we're done with that. We can set the configuration on the service that we're building, return the service, wrap it in a proxy. We're out of the factory method. And now this account manager, it's an account manager in proc. So that's a proxy type. Let's step in. So we need a user ID. We don't have one. That's okay. And all we're doing here is we are proxying into that concrete service that we created. We're going to proxy into that actual method. And we're going to call load rules on the rules access. And again, we're just running through a proxy. We're in the actual service class now, and all I'm doing in here is writing goofy stuff out to the console. Next one, load user identity async. Let's step in. We don't have a user ID, it's just empty, because I didn't assign that out in the method, and we're just going to return null. And then loader create customer profile, get config fragment. Get config frag is like just a sample method I added in here that just reaches into the options and returns some contrived nonsense. And then I'm just going to let it rip through the rest of it, but we can see down here in the console window, Azure table provider, load rules with some connection string, looking up user with ID boogity boo, loader create customer profile with config hello there, and then just run. Manage customer subscription with config hello there, store customer profile with config hello there. So that dependency is set up and going. This afternoon, I want to take a closer look at Let's get out of the customer account manager and all these proxies and interfaces and so on. Customer profile request, table provider options, don't need that. We'll close this, and this, and that. Don't need program CS. I want to take a look at these factory classes and see if I can see how much of this goo I can take out of these concrete classes and push into a base class. I feel like we could probably push a lot of it into a service factory base. But we shall see. Because having to repeat this logic every darn time I stand up a new manager, because this logic isn't really going to be very different from one service to another to another to another. And when I get into an engine, like ResourceAccess classes or ResourceAccess components, like the user identity or the rules access, they don't tend to have other custom dependencies on them. They tend to depend on things like connections to a database or connections to a storage account or some external API or an IoT, like an Internet of Things data feed or what have you. They don't tend to rely on custom components that we would inject into them. Engines do, and managers tend to have a handful of dependencies. And a lot of those dependencies are custom. And then, of course, clients can only instantiate managers. So I want to get this stuff out of my customer account manager factory into either a manager factory or perhaps an even more generic service factory. Because I feel like this code in here is going to be it's going to be the same no matter what we're trying to build up. And it doesn't make sense to have to type this in every time we want to stand up a new manager or engine or client or what have you. It'll also give us an opportunity to enforce some of the closed architectural rules that I've been talking about, where clients should never instantiate a engine or a resource access component. Clients should only ever stand up either a manager or an API component, like as dependencies, I should say. And then let the managers manage their own dependencies, let the API components handle their own dependencies, and then we don't have a whole pile of mess out in the root application's bootstrapping code. Because if you've dealt with ASP.NET Core, you know that the setup services code can become like hundreds of lines of code for a large service. And I'm trying to avoid that here. I'm also trying to avoid having the application host process know the intimate details of all of those services. Yes, it's aware that those services exist. It's got references to the implementation projects, but that's about it. It doesn't even have references to the abstractions assemblies. So it doesn't know what to do with any of this stuff. It just knows that it needs to include those files in its build and make them available to the application when it spins up. That's all it knows. And that makes me happy. As an architect, as somebody that wants the development path to be as smooth as possible with as little risk of polluting the workloads with activities and tasks that should really only belong to other specific workloads. That makes me feel a whole lot better about being able to hand this off to a development team, explain what I'm doing with all of these base classes and the construction process and so on, and then they'll understand a lot more how this closed architecture concept works. So we're going to dive into making this a lot easier for me to use and build with and expand on this afternoon. Until then, take care of yourselves. Go get some delicious food. It's Friday. Have a nice lunch. For those of you in Europe, have a nice dinner. And go hang out with some friends and do some stuff that ain't code. I should take my own advice, but I know exactly what I'm going to be doing most of the weekend. I'm going to be getting ready to launch the DM's Familiar. So, yeah. This afternoon, happy coding, friends. Take care of yourselves.